The U.S. Marines had advanced into Kuwait so quickly the Republican Guard hadn't come south to counterattack. Schwarzkopf's plan to lure them to destruction was failing. And the American and British tank forces were not due to attack until the following day. That would give the Republican Guard time to escape.
I decided to move the main attack up to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. One of the principles of the overall campaign was to inflict as much damage on the Republican Guard as we possibly could, and they were sitting very, very deep, out back in the desert. And so therefore it became obvious that if we were going to inflict that damage on the Republican Guard, we had to go ahead and inflict it as early as possible.
As the barrage lifted, American and British troops surged across the desert. This was the army that had been stationed in Europe to fight World War III against the Soviets. Now, the end of the Cold War allowed it to be unleashed against Iraq. The generals expected 2 days of fighting to breach the frontline defenses, followed by 6 days of fierce tank battles with the Republican Guard.
I thought that we would lose somewhere between, in the breaching units, that we would lose somewhere between 20 and 40%.
The American 1st Infantry Division had the job of storming the trenches to clear a path for the British tanks. To avoid hand-to-hand fighting, they planned to bury alive the Iraqi defenders. Along the Iraqi border ran a sand barrier, a berm. Beyond it lay 5 miles of minefields, and then the Iraqi trenches.
You got the first one. First berm in a minute. That's real good. The second one's a tougher one.
Bulldozers and tanks fitted with plows started to break through the berm. Driving a lead bulldozer was an 18-year-old soldier called Joe Queen.
The Iraqis are on the other side of that berm, and nobody knows where they're at until we cut through the berm.
First tank into Iraq!
Protected by tanks, Queen plowed through the minefield to the trenches.
What we did is we just took the dirt that the Iraqi soldiers had dug out and put behind the trench. You just push that dirt right back into the trench. You could just look at the man's eyes and see fear. You see him scared. You're looking at the whites of his eyes as you're going through in the trench with this bulldozer covering in the trench. And they were firing at the bulldozer. And when the first bullet that hit the blade, that made me know then, hey look, this is for real. There's no game. Those are real bullets, and a bullet will kill you.
60 miles of trenches were plowed under. Most Iraqis surrendered. The official army estimate is that 150 were buried. Joe Queen himself plowed for 20 miles.
You don't think about, hey, what about this guy? What about that guy? He had a chance to get out. He had every opportunity to get out. And he took the way to die for his country, just like any American would.
In Washington, it was Sunday morning. President Bush was awaiting news. Heavy casualties risked the destruction of his presidency and the abandonment of the war.
I got briefed just before I went into the church. The president was right ahead of me. I passed him a note that said, "Mr. President, things are going very well." We all went back to the White House. I got out a map from Time magazine to sort of show him exactly what was happening. And I was able to tell him there that things were going extraordinarily well. We had assumed that the toughest part of the ground war in terms of casualties would have been the early hours of that conflict. And in fact, what we were finding was that the air war had been enormously effective and decimated the Iraqi forces, and that they, in fact, were collapsing in front of us.
On the second day, the Marines pushed on towards Kuwait City. Ahead, they believed, lay Saddam's second line of defense, the well-equipped armored divisions of the regular Iraqi army. But for once, the Iraqis had surprise on their side. Out of the burning oil fields on the Marines' right flank, hundreds of Iraqi tanks began to advance. The Americans regrouped. They were facing a counterattack Saddam Hussein had personally approved.
أنا اعترضت على ذلك.
I objected to this. I said I'm not in favor of this counterattack because the divisions that have retreated need to double their strength before they can attack and regain their battlefield positions, and we didn't have those kind of reserves. Saddam said, no, let's leave the general in charge to sort that out. 2 hours later, they told us the divisions had regained their positions. Saddam looked at me and said, didn't I tell you this way is better?
Need to ask Charlie what time he needs these A6s.
At the Marine Air Operations Center, a response was organized. Orders were passed to a flight of 4 Cobra helicopter gunships stationed at a makeshift airbase near the Kuwaiti border. As the Cobras took off, the Marines on the ground were already fighting the largest tank battle in their history.
We'd got the word that there was an Iraqi counterattack. As we arrived out there, we saw horizon to horizon Iraqi tanks, armored vehicles. And as we started hitting these tanks and things started happening in our favor, the attack basically just ground to a halt. All the tanks stopped, the armored vehicles stopped, the hatches flew open, the Iraqis started bailing out of the tanks and, scrambling around in the desert trying to figure out what was going on.
The Iraqi troops tried to retreat into the oil smoke.
It was like, something out of a, spaghetti western with the tripwire and the horses falling. It was, as you engage these troops with 20 millimeter, it was the first time I'd ever done that, and they just kind of pitch over in the desert.
Over 100 armored vehicles were destroyed.
Flying over the oil wells, it was like something out of Dante's Inferno. The thick black oil field smoke. A littered battlefield, burning tanks. Aircraft flying around. Very surrealistic, and you almost had to slap yourself in reality to go out there and do your mission.
Saddam was told the advance on Kuwait City had resumed.
He was very upset. He was deeply depressed, and for reasons known only to himself, he accused 5 top-ranking officers of betrayal and then ordered their execution. The sentence was carried out immediately by his personal guards.
Once we broke that counterattack, we broke their back. That was the last gasp on their part to throw us back out of Kuwait. And from then on, we had a pretty straight shot into the city.
That night, a Scud missile landed on an American barracks, killing 28 soldiers, the worst casualties so far.
Oh, the people are up here!
Saddam Hussein had always hoped casualties would undermine American resolve. But now it was too late. Saddam issued a general order to withdraw.
Saddam himself issued the order to withdraw. When the land assault started, he became desperate. He was now convinced that it was impossible for him to keep Kuwait.
In Kuwait City, Iraqi soldiers began to pile into every vehicle they could find. A vast convoy took shape. These pictures were taken by the Kuwaiti resistance.
I frequently talked to the resistance in Kuwait City via satellite telephone. I picked up, and it was a colonel from the Kuwaiti Air Force who'd been trapped in Kuwait City, and he'd been in the resistance all this time. He started to tell me about the Iraqis forming up and fleeing the town. He became so emotionally happy, relieved, overjoyed about his country being freed, the terrible oppressors leaving. He started to cry. I'm embarrassed to say it, but I started to cry as well. I've never been so touched in my entire life.
An F-15 crew, their aircraft laden with bombs for an attack into Iraq, was given a new mission. They were told to attack the convoy leaving Kuwait City and stop it at all costs. As the crew walked to their aircraft, their commanding officer spoke to them. He'd received an early report of the casualties caused by the Scud missile that had landed on Dhahran.
I told him of the importance of the mission. It's not just a retreating army. And these guys are rapists, killers, murderers. And coincidentally, a Scud had just hit Dhahran airport and killed 60 Americans. And convinced them, and I'm sure that I did, that they needed to put some hate in their heart and go out and stop those son of a bitches from getting out of Kuwait.
As we dove out of the clouds, the picture was absolutely astounding. There were thousands of headlights heading on every road that led north out of Kuwait City.
It's almost like hitting the jackpot. I mean, there are vehicles all over the place. It is a very lucrative target.
We had 12 500-pound bombs, and we elected to drop them 3 at a time.
The bombs impact in a string right across the highway, with the center bomb impacting on in between 2 trucks, as a matter of fact, causing both of the trucks to burst into flame.
It might have been disorganized, but this was an armed retreat. They were shooting from the vehicles. They were shooting from manned sites on either side of the road. Missiles were fired, some randomly, some aimed.
Kraus and Seidel's bombs destroyed the lead vehicles and created a huge traffic jam. Soon, other aircraft arrived. They had had time to load up with cluster bombs.
There were many wounded people on the road, some of them without arms or legs. They were just stranded there, half dead. When they saw our car, they started to crawl towards us. We didn't have space for them. With all the strength they could muster, they were hitting the side of the car. The windows were smeared with blood. But we had no space. We had to drive on.
The pilots called it the Highway of Death. 3 days into the land war, the army that had occupied Kuwait City no longer existed as a fighting force. Thousands of footprints led off into the desert. Hundreds had been killed. In the coming hours, what had happened here would become an important factor in ending the war.
Why did we bomb them? Because there was a great deal of military equipment on that highway. I had given orders to all of my commanders that I wanted every piece of Iraqi equipment that we possibly could destroyed. This was not a bunch of innocent people just trying to make their way back across the border to Iraq. This was a bunch of rapists, murderers, and thugs who had raped and pillaged downtown Kuwait City, and now were trying to get out of the country before they were caught.
An American spy plane now recorded this radar image of the battlefield. It showed the Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's best troops, starting to escape. To Schwarzkopf's fury, American forces had yet to engage these elite divisions, over 60,000 men and their tanks.
Here we have the golden opportunity to accomplish far beyond our dreams what it is we set out to accomplish, and to get this thing over once and for all very quickly. And it doesn't seem like we are able to capitalize on that opportunity.